On the 3rd of May, 1887, a hard wind came down from the open tableland and drove chalk dust along the boardwalks of Sage Hollow in pale sheets, while the morning thermometer nailed outside the depot read 46 degrees and falling. The settlement held 312 souls between a shallow river bend and a rail spur that failed twice each winter. And those numbers mattered more than sentiment because a place that small could lose its balance in a single bad season. Wagons stood wheel-deep in spring ruts near the freight platform. Coal smoke lay thin above the roofs, and the church bell rope tapped the siding in uneven beats. From the chalk rise above town, one could see the whole arrangement at a glance. Wells sunk close for convenience, privy pits dug where ground gave easily, and homes clustered low where runoff always gathered after rain. Travis West looked over that spread as a surveyor looked over a map, not for beauty, but for consequence, and he measured risk in feet of elevation before anyone else named it aloud. He had retired from military survey duty 2 years earlier with a shoulder that ached in wet weather and a leather field case worn wide at the edges from 30 seasons of use. During his service across camps in Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado country, he had learned that hunger announced itself loudly and quickly, but sickness moved like seep water through soil, silent until a whole company failed at once. He had mapped burial grounds after spring thaws where tents had stood too near latrine trenches, and he had entered in his notebooks dates, weather, slope angles, and distances between water points and waste pits with the same precision he gave to river crossings and timber lines. In one notebook from 1873, preserved under oilcloth, a line read, "Fever follows water before it follows weather." The sentence was not philosophy to him, it was arithmetic. The knowledge had come first from duty, then from one old sergeant of engineers named Elias Boone, a Tennessean who could read runoff on bare ground the way a banker read ledgers. Boone had taught recruits to pace contour intervals with chain and rod, then made them move camp privies uphill or downwind regardless of complaint, saying that pride did not kill men half so fast as fouled wells. Boone died of pneumonia near South Pass in the winter of 1878, but his rules stayed in West's hands because they had been tested in mud, heat, and snow, and because every ignored rule left names behind. West spoke of Boone rarely and without ornament. He kept only one of the sergeant's tools, a brass pocket level with a cracked vial, and checked it against true each spring. When he arrived in Sage Hollow by freight wagon in late April, he did not inquire first at the hotel desk or the church steward. He asked for a plat, then walked the perimeter with compass and chain, while town boys watched from fence rails and guessed he was hunting silver in the bluffs. The least desirable parcel lay on a chalk rise north of the last house, a strip where grass grew thin. Wind struck hard, and wagon wheels slid in wet weather. It cost $8 for a year lease because no one expected comfort there. West paid in coin, signed in a blunt hand, and set his boundary stakes himself. He trusted contour lines more than gossip, and he chose that rise for one reason. Every storm drain in town ran away from it. Cormac Blackwood, the prosperous general merchant and the loudest voice in most council meetings, watched those first days from the shade of his porch with an expression that mixed amusement and contempt in equal measure. He was a broad man in his early 40s with polished boots, a watch chain across his vest, and the habit of speaking as though agreement had already been reached before others opened their mouths. His store sat at the center of commerce and rumor both, stocked with flour sacks, lamp oil, patent tonics, nails, bolts of cloth, and imported tins that made him richer with each freight arrival. He had built his standing on supply and timing, and when talk in his store turned to anyone who challenged custom, he answered with tight smiles and remarks about what was bad for trade. When West marked out a privy trench 70 paces downwind from his cabin site and measured the drop to a planned cistern pit twice before lifting a shovel. Blackwood laughed for the benefit of 3 teamsters and called the place West Witch Patch. By sundown, the phrase had moved along the boardwalk faster than wagon news. West answered mockery with work. He cut and fitted a one-room cabin of hand-sawn cottonwood boards, 12 feet by 18, with a steep roof pitched to drive spring rain into a gutter line feeding a covered barrel. He sank corner posts below frost depth, braced the south wall with doubled studs, and chinked every seam with a clay and straw mix that dried hard as fired tile in that high wind. He set his stovepipe through sheet iron scavenged from a damaged freight crate, then lined the hearth with stone to reduce stray spark risk in dry months. Beside the cabin, he fenced a narrow plot in 5 beds, each 4 feet across and 20 feet long, edged with fieldstone to resist washout. The beds were not ornamental. They were arranged by drainage and harvest sequence. He planted willow cuttings along the upper edge first, where roots could bind loose soil and leaves could be stripped in season for bark decoction. Then yarrow in 2 center rows for wound packing and fever support. Horehound for coughs that followed cold snaps. Comfrey for poultices where skin failed under long illness. And feverfew in a dry corner with full afternoon sun. The seed and cuttings cost $3.60 at mixed rates from passing growers and one trapper's wife who traded root divisions for lamp wicks. He recorded each source and date in his ledger. To townsfolk walking by, the rows looked like a peculiar kitchen garden tended by a man with too much spare time. To West, each row answered a known need and reduced dependence on uncertain freight. The larger task was water. Using salvaged rail fittings, a pair of iron hoops, charcoal burned from clean cottonwood, and grated sand washed 3 times, he built a covered cistern on the north side of the cabin where direct sun would be limited through summer. The pit measured 8 feet across and 9 feet deep, lined with timber staves cinched by the hoops and sealed at joints with pitch. Above the intake, he assembled a filtration box of layered gravel, sand, and charcoal beneath a slatted lid, so runoff from roof and hard rain could settle and pass through before storage. He laid an overflow trench downslope away from the privy line, then marked it with white stones so no later digging would cut it by mistake. The whole system cost $28, most of it in fittings and hauled timber, and took 12 days of labor from first shovel cut to first clear draw. By the second week of May, his rise looked less like neglected chalk and more like deliberate design. That did not soften town opinion. Blackwood repeated the nickname whenever conversation turned to West, and others embellished it by adding gestures toward the herb beds and jokes about camp tricks, as though prudence were theater and disease an old wives' tale. At the church steps one Sunday, a carpenter remarked that no man with a shovel garden could instruct a town with a bell tower and a proper council. West removed his hat, listened, and returned to setting stone borders before dusk. He had seen too many camps bury men who argued better than they measured. He spent evenings at his table with the survey notebook open beside a kerosene lamp, copying grade marks from field pages to a clean map of Sage Hollow. Well positions, pump handles, privy trenches, stable drains, and the line where spring freshet reached in wet years. His pencil moved without haste, then paused when arithmetic showed how little margin the town had granted itself. The lower wells stood convenient to homes and close to waste pits dug in shallow soil above the river bend. A warm spell sustained 3 days would raise seepage and carry filth where no one could see it. He shut the notebook, checked the cistern lid once more in the dark, and listened to the wind work over the chalk rise. The town below slept under ordinary assumptions. West kept preparing under different ones. At dawn on June 19th, when the first real heat settled over Sage Hollow and river water began pressing into low ground, The lines he had drawn on paper began to move toward flesh and consequence. By 7 o'clock that morning, the thermometer outside the depot stood at 79 degrees in shade, and by noon it reached 87, a hard, early heat for a town that still kept spring coats near its doors. The river at Sage Hollow ran thick and dull green against the bend, no longer quick with snowmelt clarity, but heavy, slow, and carrying a smell of disturbed mud that reached even the church steps. Teamsters filling barrels at the lower pumps noticed the taste first, then the clouding, then the fine grit settling at the bottom of tin cups. They called it nuisance water. West called it warning water. He rode his bay gelding, slate, from the chalk rise down through each lane with his notebook tied in oilcloth behind the saddle, watching where children had splashed the day before, where women had washed aprons in shared tubs, where stable drains from the boarding house cut shallow channels across packed earth toward kitchen gardens. The settlement still sounded ordinary, hammer strikes at the smithy, wagon axles complaining at turns, voices from Blackwood's porch bargaining over coffee and salt pork. Yet the arithmetic beneath those sounds had begun to turn against the town. By nightfall on June 20th, 2 homes on low ground reported sustained fever in adults who had no kinship tie, no shared table, and no common labor except the central pump. West recorded each address by elevation, then walked the distance to the nearest privy trench himself, counting paces and noting soil dampness with the point of his boot knife. On June 21st, a freight clerk named Owen Pike failed to report at the spur, and his bunkmate said he had burned through 2 blankets while asking for cold water, and then shivering when it came. On the same day, Alma Drever, who kept accounts for the feed shed, developed rose-colored spots on her chest and a dry tongue that cracked at the edges. West added both names to his page, then shaded the square on his map where their water had been drawn. He did not speak publicly that evening. He measured. The method came from Boone, and from the years after Boone, when West had learned that most outbreaks began with argument and ended with burial. At Fort Laramie in 1874, he had watched officers debate blame for 3 days, while enlisted men hauled fouled barrels from a creek crossing upstream from Camp Refuse. At Red Willow Station in 1881, he had seen a cookhouse shut only after 8 laborers collapsed in the same week. Each memory had left a practical rule: separate drinking water from wash water by distance and grade, move privies farther than convenience advises, burn or lime-contaminated ground, boil first, explain later. In Sage Hollow, those rules were not theory. They were the reason he had paid for chalkland no one wanted. He had not come to be admired. He had come to survive what geography would eventually demand. On June 22nd, before sunrise, he packed his saddlebags with 2 sticks of chalk, 1 small spirit level, a bundle of red cloth strips, and a folded copy of the town plat. Then began riding door to door. At each stop, he asked 3 questions in the same order. Which pump did the household use after supper? Where did they empty wash basins? How far was their privy from their well? Some answered with care, some with impatience. A ranch hand at the south lane told him to worry about his weeds and leave decent homes alone. West wrote the answer as faithfully as the useful ones. By late afternoon, he had traced 7 sickness reports to 3 draw points, all downhill from seepage pits dug less than 40 feet from groundwater lines in loose soil. In his ledger, he drew a thick pencil ring around the church pump and wrote, "Likely source 1. Immediate closure advised." He took that ledger to the council bench beside the Mercantile at 5:30, when most men in town gathered for evening trade. Cormac Blackwood stood near the weighing counter in a clean linen shirt with cuffs rolled once, his watch chain bright in the lowering light. while sacks of flour and barrels of molasses framed him like property made visible. West set the map flat on a crate and held it at two corners so wind would not fold it. He spoke in measured sentences, naming houses, elevations, and dates, then pointed with the chalk to the drainage lines that connected latrine seepage to the 3 contaminated pumps. He asked for immediate closure of those pumps, mandatory boiling for every household, and lime spread over pits before the next warm rain. The crowd listened in that peculiar silence that means attention without agreement. Blackwood let him finish. Then he stepped forward, touched one finger to the map as though testing wet paint, and smiled toward the men on the porch rail. He said Sage Hollow needed steady trade, not panic drawn in pencil by a retired soldier who had mistaken camp discipline for town governance. He said heat spoiled meat and weakened constitutions, and that Providence had its own designs no surveyor could chart. He held up 3 bottles of patent cordial from a crate marked St. Louis and announced a temporary price of $1.20 each, triple the winter rate, because supply was uncertain and demand had grown. He called West Witch Patch again, louder this time, and said he would not let hedge remedies and ditch arguments cripple commerce in planting season. Several voices answered with rough approval. 2 women near the hitch rail turned away without speaking and walked home with empty pails. West rolled his map, tied it, and left without reply. At the rise, he lit his lamp, copied the day's addresses to a clean page, and marked each with a cross if the household had agreed to boil water. Only 5 crosses appeared on that first line. Before sleep, he measured out dried willow bark, feverfew, and yarrow into 12 paper packets of equal weight, each packet enough for 3 decoctions, then stacked them beside his door. The herbs could not cure contaminated water. They could ease pain, lower fever strain, and help the weak keep fluids if sanitation held. The larger work remained earthwork and rule work. At dawn on June 23rd, he walked to the lime shed behind the brickyard and paid $4.10 for 3 sacks, then borrowed a cart and began treating pits closest to the lower wells, 1 shovel cast at a time. By the time he returned the cart at dusk, talk had already outrun him through every lane. Men on porch rails repeated Blackwood's jokes as though laughter could settle runoff, while mothers at pump lines lowered their voices and counted who had taken fever since market day. West washed the lime from his hands, recopied his closure notes by lamplight, and set his alarm watch for first light. The heat did not break. On June 24th, the noon reading reached 91, and flies rose from stable corners in black swarms each time a door opened. West posted boiling instructions at the church gate in a firm hand. Rolling boil no less than 10 minutes for drinking water. Vessels scrubbed with ash and rinsed in boiled water only. No shared dipper at pumps. No wash runoff to kitchen rows. By evening, half the notice had been torn away. He replaced it with a second copy and added red cloth flags on stakes at the 3 draw points he had marked unsafe. Boys pulled 1 flag as a prank. He reset it before dusk. 2 households on higher ground asked him to inspect their wells. He found 1 sound and 1 at risk from a nearby hog trench, and he told the owner to move the trench by morning. The owner said he would think on it. West said thinking would not change grade. Sunday, June 26th, brought the rupture that no one could dismiss as private misfortune. The church was full for noon service, windows propped open against the heat, hymn books damp in hands. During the final hymn, while the congregation stood, the hand pump at the side table gave up 2 buckets of cloudy water with a sour smell that reached the front pews. A respected matron, Beatrice Harlan, age 56, drank half a cup, sat down hard, and fainted before the last verse ended. She was carried to shade, revived briefly, then began vomiting clear fluid and could not stand without support. The pastor sent for Blackwood and for Councilman Reeve at once. By 2 o'clock, half the town had heard of cloudy church water, and even those who mocked West's warnings stopped drawing from that pump. The council met at 4 under the mercantile awning, not by preference, but because the hall held trapped heat like an oven. West arrived with his notebook, his marked plat, and a bundle of red flags under one arm. Blackwood arrived with his account book and 2 unopened crates of tonic stacked where all could see. Reeve asked for testimony house by house, and for the first time the pattern stood in public speech rather than private pages. Fever in homes linked by drawpoints, stomach sickness after church water, wells nearest shallow pits turning sour after 3 warm days. West asked again for closures and quarantine cabins on high ground. Blackwood argued closures would ignite fear, halt trade, and invite outsiders to say Sage Hollow was plague-marked. He repeated that West's herb stock was no basis for policy. West answered that policy rested on runoff and waste, not on herbs, and that herbs were only support while clean water and separation did their slower work. Debate held for 2 hours, then broke when Alma Drever's brother arrived breathless from the feed shed and said she had begun delirious speech and could no longer keep broth down. The council voted 4-2 to close 3 pumps for 7 days pending inspection, to require boiling notices in every lane, and to authorize lime distribution from town stores at fixed ration. Blackwood objected to fixed ration, then yielded when Reeve threatened seizure authority under emergency charter language from 1882. The decision passed into action by sundown. West and 3 volunteers drove stakes and rope around the closed pumps, posted notices with times and penalties, and began converting his smokehouse into a fever shed with 6 cots spaced 4 feet apart, wash barrels at each entrance, and a ledger line for every cup of boiled water given and retained. Through that long evening, while the town adjusted in anger, fear, and reluctant obedience, West worked by lantern with the same steadiness he had brought to contour lines and trench angles. He mixed willow decoction in iron kettles at 1 ounce bark to 1 quart water, simmered 20 minutes, strained through clean muslin, and labeled each jar with date and hour. He cut comfrey leaves, bruised them with warm water and mustard powder in measured spoons, and wrapped the paste in cloth squares for poultice use on pressure sores and abdominal cramping, changing each wrap every 3 hours to avoid skin burn. He wrote each preparation in his ledger, not to dignify his own effort, but to keep dosage orderly when fatigue blurred judgment. At the smokehouse door near midnight, one ranch wife asked whether the mockery in town had angered him. He handed her 2 jars and said, "Let them talk, but boil every cup." Then he returned to the bench and prepared the next set before dawn. Before dawn broke fully over the chalk rise, he was still at the bench, tying muslin over cooling jars and marking each one in a hand that did not wander even when his shoulders shook from fatigue. At first light, he rang an iron spoon against the smokehouse latch to gather the volunteers, then assigned them by steadiness rather than status, because he had learned in camp years that rank dissolved quickly where fever ran. 2 women who had been mocked beside the hitch rail the previous week were placed over the wash kettles. A ranch hand who had laughed at red flags was sent to split fuel and carry water uphill until his hands blistered. West took no satisfaction from either correction. He only needed the work done right. He expanded the smokehouse plan before breakfast. The 6 original cots became 10 by mid-morning, each frame spaced 4 feet and 6 inches apart to reduce shared air and accidental contact, with canvas screens hung between every second bed where delirium made patients thrash. He drove 2 separate entrance routes with stakes and rope, one for those carrying food and water, one for those removing soiled linen and waste. At the threshold, he set libasons made from sifted wood ash, then posted a written order that no vessel crossed from dirty side to clean side without full scrub and boil. The order was copied 3 times because wind and wet hands would ruin paper before noon. By the morning of June 27th, the quarantine line had stretched beyond what one outbuilding could hold. West marked 3 new cabin sites on the upper shoulder of his leased parcel, above runoff and 30 paces downwind from the main cook fire. Each cabin measured 10 by 12 feet, with a low loft for supplies and 2 narrow shutter windows cut opposite each other for cross-draft. He paid $7 a day for a 2-man carpenter crew and $1.25 for each load of salvage plank, then kept accounts in a separate column titled Emergency Public Debt, because he intended no private claim over a public necessity. On the first cabin, he ordered a double-door threshold wrapped in tarred cloth to hold out dust and flies. On the second, he insisted the floor be raised 8 inches above ground grade with stone piers, so wash water could be directed under and away. On the third, he saved cost by using half logs and clay chinking, trading time for materials as the rail spur failed to deliver fresh timber. He treated water distribution as a survey problem with lives attached. 2 boiling stations were established, one by the churchyard and one by the old brickyard, each with measured kettles and posted timing boards. A full rolling boil was marked with chalk at 10 minutes minimum, and a second mark at 12 minutes for doubtful sources. Each bucket leaving those stations was tagged with a narrow strip of blue cloth tied under the handle, then checked by name in the ledger at issue and return. Any household returning a bucket untagged was denied refill until the vessel had been scrubbed and reboiled in public view. The rule angered many. It reduced argument by replacing opinion with a visible process. West had spent too many years watching invisible contamination defeat polite assurances. His herb stores, once seen as hobby rows on worthless ground, became integrated into the regimen without being allowed to replace sanitation. Willow bark decoction went first to those with crushing headache and sustained heat, 1 cup every 4 hours when stomach permitted. Yarrow infusion was used for sweating patients who could not rest, measured thin and frequent rather than heavy and rare. Comfrey and mustard poultices were applied only by trained hands and removed on schedule to prevent skin injury, then discarded into lime pits away from all draw points. He refused 3 requests for strong tonic mixtures sold in town, saying bluntly that sugar and alcohol might calm fear, but did not interrupt transmission. That refusal cost him nothing in coin and much in goodwill. He kept refusing. At noon, he set a slate board outside the smokehouse and wrote daily tallies: active fever beds, new suspected cases, recovered enough for home watch, deaths. The death line remained blank through that day, and the blank gave the town a fragile thread to hold. It also invited a new form of resistance, quieter than public shouting, but more corrosive because it wore the language of common sense. Men at the well rope said if no one had died yet, perhaps the rules were excessive. Women standing with pails said perhaps cloudy water was only summer silt. A drover said he had drunk river water from Texas to Idaho and had never been ordered by a retired mapmaker to count minutes over a kettle. The phrase mapmaker moved through town with edge and mockery, a cousin to witchpatch, less theatrical and just as dismissive. Blackwood adapted faster than his critics expected. He did not openly defy the council vote after Reeve threatened seizure authority, but he narrowed the rules by interpretation until they were barely rules at all. On June 28th, he placed 2 barrels near his porch labeled Tested Clear Draw and sold from them at 15 cents a dipper to travelers and impatient locals, insisting the water had settled and was as sound as any in June. No one could prove at once from which source those barrels were filled. West sent a volunteer to ask for inspection rights. Blackwood refused and said commerce could not operate by rumors from a smokehouse ledger. The exchange drew a crowd by itself. Someone from the back shouted that West would soon charge rent for breathing his clean hill air. Laughter followed. It ended only when Beatrice Harlan's daughter stepped forward with a boiled water tag in hand and asked who among them would sit all night beside a fever cot if the barrels were wrong. The next evening, during ration issue at the churchyard, a torn pamphlet appeared nailed to the notice post in rough block letters. No town governed by weeds. West read it once, pulled the nail, folded the paper, and put it into his case without comment. The gesture did not calm the lane. Boys repeated the line at the edge of earshot, while men pretended not to hear. A deacon who had opposed closures told 3 households that prayer and ordinary cleanliness were sufficient, and that extreme measures invited panic worse than illness. West walked to that deacon's yard after dark with 2 jars and a bar of lye soap, reviewed boiling procedure in full, and left. He did not ask for public support. He asked only for compliance and repeated his reasons with patient exactness. Some called it stubbornness. Others began to call it discipline. 3 days passed before the council's first inspection round reached the lower wells. By then, heat had hardened every smell in town. Privy trenches gave off a sweet rot at midday. Stable drains shimmered with grease and insect film. The lower lane pump, though roped shut, showed damp, churned mud around the platform where someone had drawn by night and wiped the handle clean. West knelt, pressed 2 fingers into the mud, and found fresh boot ridges beneath the crust. He posted a guard rotation at once, 2 hours each through dark, and took the first watch himself. At 1:30 he caught a teamster cutting the rope with a pocket blade, desperate for quick water after a long haul. West took the blade, handed him a tagged bucket, and made him walk uphill to the boiling station under moonlight. Neither man spoke on that climb. The social exclusion sharpened when fear looked for a target it could name. Families who had accepted his rules found themselves passed over at Blackwood's counter when crowds formed, served last for flour or lamp oil unless they paid cash in full. Children from those homes were told to keep distance at the schoolyard fence. One woman who worked the wash line at the smokehouse returned to find a chalk mark painted on her gate, a crooked sprig meant to mock the herb rose above town. West organized a quiet response. He reassigned supply pickups to mixed pairs, 1 household from his roster and 1 from those still skeptical, then required signatures from both at issue and delivery. Mutual dependence did not produce affection. It reduced open sabotage. In outbreaks, reduced harm was victory enough. Near sunset on June 30th, clouds built in high tiers west of the ridge and then thinned without rain, leaving a brass-colored sky and a wind that shifted twice in 1 hour. West noted the shift because wind direction controlled how fly swarms moved from trench lines to cook areas. He ordered every kitchen in his regiment to hang wet cloth over food shelves, burn pitch at doors, and keep waste barrels covered with weighted lids, then sent runners with written copies of the order. Some households followed at once. Others said weather signs belonged to farmers and old wives and could wait until morning. By morning, the flies were thicker, not at random but concentrated along the side gully behind the boarding house where gray wash water had been poured for weeks. The gully fed shallow garden wells used by 6 homes that had not touched the church pump since closure day. On July 1st, he walked that gully end to end with a pole rod, measuring slope drop every 20 paces and marking seep points with red chalk on stone. At 2 spots, he found suds, crust, and food scraps trapped in reed roots, clear proof of repeated wash dumping. At the lower turn, he scraped back 2 inches of soil and smelled the sour edge that had become familiar in camp outbreaks. He filled 3 glass vials from separate seep pools, corked them, and set them on a board in full sun beside 3 vials from his cistern for comparison. By late afternoon, the gully vials had gone cloudy with suspended matter, while the cistern samples remained clear. He carried the board to council without speech and placed it between Reeve and Blackwood. Reeve stared at the vials for a long minute, then asked who had authorized waste dumping into a drainage line that touched hand-dug wells. The boarding house keeper said no one had authorized it and everyone had done it. Blackwood argued that clouding in a bottle proved little beyond mud content and that town life could not cease every time a ditch ran foul. West answered with addresses, dates, and the fresh pattern emerging in his ledger. 12 new fevers in homes outside the original pump ring, all within runoff reach of that side gully. He asked for immediate closure of the garden wells, trench diversion before dawn, and a compulsory wash station uphill with runoff directed to lime pits. Council approved 2 measures and delayed the third for debate over labor cost. West did not argue cost. He wrote names for the trench crew and began assembling tools. By first light on July 2nd, red flags stood in a second line across Sage Hollow, and many who had mocked them now watched those strips in silence, because the pattern had widened and no one could pretend the danger was confined to one pump, one lane, or one man's chalk rise. By mid-morning on July 2nd, the second line of red flags was still snapping hard in a dry wind when the sky to the south went the color of old brass, and the depot vane began turning in short, frantic circles. The noon thermometer read 93 degrees in shade, yet the wind carried no relief, only grit. And by 1 o'clock, the first dust wall rose beyond the freight road as a low brown ridge that climbed as it advanced. Men on rooftops shouted for shutters. Teamsters cut mule traces and ran them blind toward lee walls. West stood at the church boiling station with his watch open, counted the rolling boil to 12 minutes, and then looked once toward the ridgeline where the storm had erased distance and shape alike. He sent runners at once, cover kettles, tie lids, move all fever cots from window draft, wet cloth over mouths. No one argued, not then. The storm struck at 1:27 with a force that turned speech into gesture. Dust drove through alley gaps, under doors, through cracked sashes and down chimneys in a constant abrasive stream that coated bread, blankets, lamp chimneys, and open wounds with the same indifferent hand. The wind was not weather now. It was a tool of attrition, stripping roof shingles from 2 cabins on the lower lane and lifting the unfinished wash diversion trench into the air as a choking ribbon of dry earth. At the brickyard station, one kettle stand collapsed when a support peg pulled loose in loosened soil. 6 gallons of boiled water went into the dust before men could right it. At the church station, blue issue tags tore from 3 bucket handles, and West ordered those vessels reboiled from the start rather than guessed safe by memory. By 2 o'clock, daylight had thinned to a copper dusk. Between 2 and 5, Sage Hollow lost its outward composure in measured pieces. The stage road disappeared under drifts of powdered chalk and sand. Wheel ruts leveled into one pale sheet that offered no track to follow. The telegraph line to the spur pole yard failed where an old splice gave way under strain, leaving the depot clerk with no way to confirm the expected rail car of flour, lamp oil, and carbolic soap. At 4:10, a boy from the platform reached town with his hat tied over his face and reported the afternoon train had not entered the valley and likely would not until visibility returned. West wrote the missed delivery in his ledger and changed the ration line immediately. Flour at half issue, sugar by medical use only, clean cloth by bed count, not by household request. He moved the fever tally board from outside to inside the smokehouse door, so dust would not scour the chalk unreadable. By evening, the gusts were still climbing, with the depot anemometer arm striking 50 miles per hour before sticking hard against its stop. West shifted from prevention to endurance and laid out what he called the emergency grid, not as proclamation but as assignment. Dawn and dusk water distribution only, each run under escort. Broth kitchens consolidated from 4 fires to 2 to save fuel and labor. Isolation rotation on 6-hour turns with mandatory wash at entry and exit. No exceptions for clergy, council, or merchants. Burial detail prepared with lime, shrouds, and depth markers in advance because hard ground could not be cut quickly if deaths came in clusters. Upstream laundering vats moved 40 paces higher, with trench drains cut by lanterns so used, water did not return toward draw points. The plan cost time, strength, and pride. It preserved order where panic would have multiplied contagion. By the evening of July 3rd, 31 active fever cases were recorded across Sage Hollow, with 7 patients too weak to sit and 13 unable to keep unboiled water down for more than an hour. The dust storm had not passed cleanly but lingered in waves, a day and a night, and then another day of reduced sight and rasping lungs, sealing roads and fraying every routine that depended on movement. Women who had once measured flour for pies now measured salt by quarter spoon into rehydration broth. Men who had mocked the red flags now stood in line with tagged pails and waited without complaint while kettles rolled. West's chalk rise, chosen for grade and runoff, held cleaner than the lower lanes. His cistern remained clear under a sealed lid, while open barrels in town took on grit and insect film between one check and the next. Preparation did not remove suffering. It narrowed its path. The first death in the storm week was Martha Keene, age 32, who had entered fever watch 10 days earlier and had fought in quiet cycles of heat, chill, brief clarity, and renewed delirium while her 2 daughters sat shifts outside the screen line, reciting hymn verses she had taught them. Near midnight on July 3rd, her pulse weakened to a thin, irregular thread, despite steady broth, willow decoction, and cool cloth rotations. She asked twice whether the wash had been taken from clean water, then stopped speaking and did not rise again. Because swelling had fixed her wedding band tight through the final days, West used rendered tallow and thread patience to remove it after death and passed it, wrapped in muslin, to her oldest daughter at dawn. The girl tied the ring to a cord and wore it under her collar through the remainder of quarantine. Owen Pike, the freight clerk, died the next afternoon with the storm still grinding against the shutters. He had been broad-shouldered and quick with sums at the depot desk, a man known for keeping manifests neat even in snow season, and in illness he diminished quickly, not from neglect but from the relentless tax of fever and gut distress that emptied him faster than any cup could replace. He was lucid in short windows and used one of those windows to ask that his mother in Laramie receive his pay envelope and his brass pen nib case. West wrote the note himself, sealed it in wax, and placed it in the ledger pocket, reserved for personal effects. Owen asked for water in the final hour, could not retain it, and then lay still with one hand over the blanket seam as if holding a page in place. Beatrice Harlan did not recover from her church collapse, despite 2 brief rallies that misled her family into hope. She had been a strong organizer of winter relief drives, known for carrying coal scuttles herself when widows were short, and her bed drew visitors in careful rotation because half the town believed it owed her old debts of kindness. On July 4th, near sunset, as the wind eased for the first time in 2 days, she opened her eyes long enough to ask whether the church pump had been sealed with boards, not rope, because she said rope invited temptation. Reeve answered that boards were already being cut. She nodded once, reached for her daughter's hand, and died before the lamp was trimmed. West entered her name on the tally board in a script as exact as the others, then stood silent while the family chose hymns for a burial that weather postponed until dawn. Loss altered speech in Sage Hollow more effectively than any ordinance. Jokes about weeds and mapmakers ceased. The phrase West Witch Patch disappeared from porches as though the wind had sanded it away. In its place came practical questions asked without ornament. How long must this boil? Which trench line is safe? Can two households share one kettle if scrubbed between draws? West answered each one and repeated answers when exhaustion erased memory. He slept in intervals of 20 minutes on a bench outside the smokehouse, boots still on, watch in hand, waking to rotate poultices and check fluid ledgers. Comfrey and mustard packs, changed on strict schedule, eased cramping enough for several patients to resume sipping broth. Willow bark reduced pounding head pain that had driven some to tear at their own blankets. None of it was miracle. All of it was labor. Cormac Blackwood's standing failed in public view as his inventory failed on the shelf. The merchant who had once spoken from a full porch now faced a store floor scoured by need, tonic crates unopened and unwanted, sugar bins restricted to medical issue, lamp oil measured by ounce for night nursing, cloth bolts cut to strips under West's written ratios. Men demanded credit he could not extend. Women demanded boiling pots he did not have. At noon on July 5th, with dust still drifting in thin sheets through the street and the rail spur silent for a third day, Blackwood unlocked his back room and found one of his barrel taps caked with dried sediment and fly eggs where seal wax had cracked in heat. He threw the tap into a bucket, washed his hands until they reddened, and shut the office door that had once separated proprietor from petitioners. When he emerged, his collar was unbuttoned, his coat gone and his voice lower by half. Late that same afternoon, he crossed the boardwalk to West's rise carrying no ledger and no pretense of authority, only a water bucket and a folded blanket under one arm. He stopped at the smokehouse threshold, waited for the wash basin, scrubbed as instructed, and then said in plain terms that 6 souls in rooms above his store had fever and 2 of his clerks had collapsed between shifts. He asked for cots, rehydration broth, and instruction for his remaining staff. No apology came with the request. None was demanded. West called for 2 volunteers, opened the supply book, and assigned Blackwood's rooms as Annex 3 under the same rules as every other shelter. Boiled water tags, 6-hour linen rotation, waste to lime pit, no shared dipper, no private reserves. Blackwood listened, repeated each order back, and wrote them down in his own hand. Night fell clearer on July 5th, the storm finally moving east in a long, low band, and for the first time in 3 days, stars were visible above the ridge, sharp and cold over a town that smelled of ash, lye, fever sweat, and damp earth newly cut for drainage. West walked the line of cots once more, adjusted a poultice at one bedside, marked intake at another, and then stepped outside to the slate board. He erased the old count and wrote the new one under lantern light. Active 31, new 2, recovered 3, dead 3. Behind him, from the lower lane to the churchyard and up to the chalk rise, kettles were already being set for the dawn boil. The argument in Sage Hollow had narrowed to a single question at last. Not whether his methods were strange, but whether the town had the discipline to keep them long enough to live. At dawn on the 6th of July, while the chalk marks were still fresh on the slate board, Travis moved from cot to cot with a measuring spoon in one hand and the intake ledger in the other, and he began the day as he had begun every day since closure orders, by turning fear into sequence. He assigned Blackwood to water detail under Ruth Harlan's supervision, paired 2 skeptical ranchmen with the wash crew they had avoided, and posted written steps at every station. Boil, cool covered, issue by tag, record by name, return vessel, scrub, boil again. The system held because it asked no one to believe in him. It asked them to follow a method that could be checked. Before noon, he opened his storehouse door and gave out what remained of his private provisions without reserve. 23 pounds of dried beans, 11 pounds of barley, 4 sacks of onions, 8 jars of pickled beets, and every strip of smoked venison hung from the rafters. He entered each transfer as public debt to be settled later, only if the town survived to settle anything at all. Blackwood watched those pages fill and said nothing for a long while. The merchant had once guarded stock by margin and timing. Yet, here stood a man on leased chalk ground, whose entire winter reserve vanished in one morning by deliberate choice, and whose authority increased as his shelves thinned. The contrast did not stay abstract. At the mercantile, patent cordial bottles remained stacked and useless at $1.20 each. Labels bright, corks intact, while beside the smokehouse door a plain kettle of salted broth, made from bones and onion skins, kept 3 fever patients upright long enough to swallow boiled water. West's $28 cistern, built from salvage and stubborn labor, still drew clear through sand and charcoal. 2 expensive barrel lots bought in haste from passing wagons had gone sour within 48 hours because lids had been left loose in storm grit. Prosperity had purchased display. Preparation had purchased endurance. By 8th July, new cases had fallen to 1 in 24 hours, and for the first time since June, the noon bell rang for work shifts rather than emergency summons. West used the breathing room to teach, not to rest. He drove stakes in the churchyard and made crews pace distances in public, 60 feet from any privy trench to any draw point at minimum in firm soil, 80 where the grade tipped toward a well, 100 if spring runoff crossed the lane. He set the 3 cloudy gully vials beside 3 clear cistern vials on a plank table and had each household head inspect both in full light. He did not dramatize the difference. He asked them to name it: mud, suspended matter, sour odor. Then he asked where they had emptied wash water last week, lessons rooted deeper when spoken by the guilty. By evening, those same household heads were marking new drain paths in chalk behind kitchens and boarding rooms, then copying distances onto scrapboards to carry home before memory softened. The lower lane boys who had once mocked red flags were sent with lanterns to recheck covers on cooling kettles, and they did the rounds without complaint. At the smokehouse door, West amended the Judy slate for dawn. 2 extra hands on scrub barrels, 1 on lime issue, 1 at the churchyard station to verify tags before first light. 3 days passed before the telegraph splice was repaired and the depot could send outbound messages. On July 11th, West walked to the office with Owen Pike's sealed note, his pay envelope, and the brass pen nib case wrapped in oilcloth. He stood while the clerk copied the address to Owen's mother in Laramie, paid the transmission fee and freight postage himself, and entered both amounts in the public ledger, $1.90 total, under the line marked Obligations of the Dead. On the same afternoon, he delivered Martha Keene's wedding band, now cleaned and tied to a stronger cord, and placed Eli Turner's slate into his father's hands with the chalk sums still visible from the last lesson. None of those deliveries eased grief. They closed duties that fever had interrupted. The board over the church pump went in on July 12th, not rope but plain pine as Beatrice Harlan had requested before her death, fastened with iron spikes and tar sealed at the seams. Reeve ordered the old platform dismantled and the shaft packed with lime and rubble to prevent desperate reopening. At sunset, Blackwood carried the first plank himself and set it down without speaking. 2 boys from the lower lane, who had once yanked red flags for sport, helped tamp fill with shovel handles until dark. When they finished, no one suggested reopening for convenience. The reckoning did not arrive as one grand speech beneath a banner. It came as a line of practical acts that had moral weight, because each act reversed an earlier contempt. On July 13th, the carpenter who had mocked a shovel garden brought 6 dressed boards and asked where to frame wash tables on higher grade. On July 14th, the deacon who had said prayer and ordinary cleanliness were sufficient appeared at dawn with lime sacks over both shoulders and worked trench lines until his palms split. On July 15th, the ranch hand who had laughed at red flags asked for a copy of the boiling notice to nail on his own gate. Each request carried the same unspoken admission. They had mistaken familiar custom for safety. Blackwood's reckoning was public because his mockery had been public. On the 16th of July, when the street was passable again, and 50 or more souls gathered near the mercantile porch for ration revision, he stepped forward in work shirt sleeves with no watch chain, no coat, and no account book in hand. He repeated his own words so none could soften them later. He said he had called West Witch Patch before this town, and had called discipline hedge tricks because he mistook prosperity for knowledge. He said he had sold false comfort at triple price while neighbors were entering fever, and that he had defended trade arithmetic while burial depth was being measured behind the church. Then he unlocked the office safe, took out his private reserve ledger, and read aloud every household credit he was canceling, including interest, through the month of July. He ended by placing the safe key on West's table for emergency use and stepping back into the crowd. A wind moved dust along the plank road, and nobody spoke over it. Several people who had bought those cordials stood with their hats in both hands, eyes fixed on the tally board instead of the man who had sold to them. Reeve kept his place by the church steps and made no motion to rescue the moment with official phrasing. The silence held until West chose to break it. When the crowd turned toward West, he did not answer at once. He looked first to the tally board, then to the 3 names written in the death column, and only then to the souls waiting in that lane. His voice carried because the street had gone still. He said, Martha Keene, Owen Pike, Eli Turner. He said those names were the cost of delay, pride, and divided rules, and no speech could lower that cost. He said forgiveness offered too quickly would be another form of neglect, because it would allow the town to feel absolved without becoming safer. He said he would not withhold knowledge, food, or labor from any household in Sage Hollow, but he would tie every future kindness to practice. Distances measured, wells sighted by grade, boil notices obeyed, waste controlled, records kept. He set Boone's cracked pocket level on the table where all could see it and said the tool had outlived its owner because it reported truth without regard for pride. Then he opened the survey notebook to the page that read, Fever follows water before it follows weather, and passed it to Reeve, then to Blackwood, then through the front rank one by one. Several who read it cried openly. Others simply nodded and returned the book with both hands, as though returning a borrowed thing of weight. No one asked for easy words after that. On July 18th, the slate board showed new 0 for the first time. West did not celebrate. He reduced emergency rations in controlled steps and shifted crews from bedside watch to reconstruction detail. By the second week of August, he had trained 4 permanent water stewards, 2 from families that had supported him from the start, and 2 from households that had fought him longest. He required each steward to map runoff after every heavy rain and submit notes at council meetings. The red flags were not discarded. They were folded, stacked, and stored in the church vestry for future closures. By late August, routine had returned in fragments rather than all at once. The noon bell kept work time again, but now it also marked inspection rounds. Lids checked, trench lines cleared, wash drains regraded where wheel ruts had redirected flow. West moved through those rounds with the same ledger he had carried during the storm week. its pages swollen from damp and ash, adding fresh entries beside old losses so no one could pretend one season was separate from the next. By October 1887, Sage Hollow adopted written sanitation ordinances by unanimous vote, fixed minimum distances between privies and wells, mandatory boil notices for 10 days after floodwater or pump clouding, separate wash drains for boarding houses and stables, and compulsory lime treatment for any pit within runoff reach of a draw point. The population reduced to 309 souls, rebuilt around those lines. Blackwood paid from his own profits $112.40 for the first stone-lined public cistern under West's measurements, including a covered sand and charcoal box and an overflow trench marked with white stone. The old nickname did not vanish. It transformed. Children now used Witchpatch to mean the communal medicinal plot beside the schoolhouse, where yarrow and feverfew grew in labeled rows and lessons in boiling procedure were taught each spring. No one ever admitted to writing the No Town Governed by Weeds pamphlet. West kept the folded sheet in his case for years, not as grievance but as a record of what fear sounds like before it learns discipline. He also kept the 3 original cloudy vials, corks sealed in wax, and set them out each planting season beside clear water samples so new families could see what words often fail to convey. Distinctive signs became durable habits. Boarded pumps after contamination were now expected, not debated. Bucket tags were routine. Runoff maps hung in the council room beside freight schedules. Years later, travelers crossing that valley heard work crews give a simple instruction when building corrals, laying drains, or siting winter sheds. Set it by Westline. The phrase carried no drama. It meant measure first, boast never, and build for the worst day, not the easiest one. Blackwood grew older at his counter and never again sold patent comfort above fair price during illness season. Reeves' successors kept the runoff ledger as part of official town records. School children copied Boone's sentence in penmanship drills each April before thaw. The herb beds on the chalk rise still stand in ordered strips of willow, yarrow, horehound, comfrey, and feverfew, bordered by stone and turned each year by hands that did not witness the summer of 1887, but live because others did. The cistern still holds clear under its lid when dust runs and heat presses low ground into error. Sage Hollow still counts its souls with care. Its oldest practical law remains the one paid for in grief and carried forward in work. Humble preparation, faithfully taught and shared without spite, can carry a whole town through its worst arithmetic. 3 mornings after that law was spoken and carried into custom, Travis stood in the churchyard beside a trestle table laid with tools instead of scripture, and he taught 47 souls how to read a slope with a cord, 2 stakes, and Boone's cracked pocket level, while Blackwood held the far stake in both hands and waited for correction like any hired man. Travis marked a line in chalk, had them pour 1 bucket of clean water uphill and 1 downhill, then made them watch where each stream settled, where each strand of wet earth darkened first, and where each path disappeared beneath boards that looked dry from above. "You do not cite by convenience," he said, voice flat with fatigue and authority both. "You cite by consequence. If your wife can reach a pump in 10 steps, and your waist reaches it in 8, you built a grave with a handle." No one laughed. Children from the schoolhouse copied the measurements on slate. 60 feet, 80 on fall, 100 with crossing runoff. On the 3rd of November 1887, with frost whitening the hitch rails at dawn, the first stone-lined public cistern reached full depth under West's measurements, 8 feet across, 9 feet deep, with dressed sandstone set in lime mortar, and a filtration box layered exactly as his own had been layered on the chalk rise. Blackwood paid the mason in cash before noon, $112.40 counted in public. then asked Travis to inspect each seam before coverboards were fixed. Travis found 2 voids no larger than a thumb, ordered both repacked, and waited in silence until the mason finished. At the dedication, there was no ribbon and no speech from counsel. There was only Beatrice Harlan's daughter, Ruth, drawing the first bucket through the new filter, holding it up to winter light and saying, "Clear." The word carried down the lane like a bell. By the second week of November, a letter arrived at the depot addressed to Travis West in a narrow hand from Laramie, Wyoming territory. He opened it at the telegraph desk with the clerk as witness, because the letter answered an obligation entered in the line marked Obligations of the Dead. Owen Pike's mother wrote that she had received the pay envelope, the brass pen nib case, and the note sealed in wax, and that she had read her son's final request aloud at table before laying his case beside his father's watch. She enclosed $2 to repay postage and transmission. Travis folded the money back into the letter, walked to the church office, and placed both in the town archive ledger under Owen's name, with a receipt signed by Reeve and Blackwood. "The account is closed," he said. "The debt remains honored." That afternoon, he nailed a small shelf in the council room and placed 3 labeled bundles there: return receipts of the dead, inspection maps, and emergency orders from June through July, so memory would not depend on rumor again. The reckoning moved in a steady line of doorstep conversations after first snow, each one plain and undramatic, each one harder than a public declaration, because it required 2 faces and no audience. The carpenter who had mocked the shovel garden came first at dusk with a wrapped loaf and stood in the entry without removing his hat, until invited. "I said no man with weeds could instruct this town," he told Travis. "My own well sat 32 feet from a pit, and I did not know enough to fear it. My boy drank from that line. He recovered because you taught his mother to boil until the kettle lid rattled." Travis set the loaf on the shelf, handed him a copy of the new sighting diagram, and answered, "Frame your new privy line by this and bring your measurements tomorrow." The deacon came next and confessed that he had told household's prayer and ordinary cleanliness were sufficient. Travis gave him the lime ledger and assigned him winter inspection rounds. "If your words carried weight," he said, "your labor must carry weight now." On December 9th, Blackwood came after closing his store, boots crusted white and hands red from loading flour. He set the safe key on Travis's table, the same key he had surrendered in July, and spoke without his old porch voice. He said he had used fear as inventory, then sold certainty at triple price because he believed control was the same thing as stewardship. He admitted that the No Town Governed by Weeds pamphlet had been written in his back office by his own pen and nailed by a clerk at his instruction. "I did not hang it myself," he said, "but I sent it into the street." He named the clerk, who had since left on a freight wagon for Casper. And he did not ask Travis to excuse any of it. Travis listened, unfolded the old pamphlet from his case, and laid it beside the key. "Then it will be archived under your name," he said. "Not for humiliation, for record." Blackwood nodded once, signed the margin in ink, and remained at the table while Travis wrote the entry. Anonymous pamphlet no longer anonymous, source acknowledged, lesson retained. The town gathered formally only once, on January 2nd, 1888, in the church hall with 2 stoves burning and breath still visible near the back doors. Reeve called the meeting to settle whether Sage Hollow would fund annual training or let habit decay under ordinary weather. 59 adults and 13 older school children attended. Travis stood when called, not at the pulpit but beside the wall map, where red and blue lines still marked contamination and safe draws from the summer outbreak. He spoke for fewer than 5 minutes. He named Martha Keene, Owen Pike, Eli Turner, then pointed to the map and said, "These names are not arguments. They are boundary stones. You may step past them if you wish, but you will not step past consequence. He declined the motion to name the cistern after him and moved instead that it be named Harlan Pike Keene Turner Public Cistern, so every draw carried memory of both the dead and the disciplined. The motion passed 48-11. By spring thaw of 1888, the medicinal plot beside the schoolhouse was turned with measured rows and labeled stakes, and Travis taught 2 afternoons each month with Ruth Harlan and the schoolteacher at his side, one reading names and dosages, one reading distances and runoff rules. Children learned the difference between support and cure before they were old enough to vote in council. Willow bark was weighed on brass scales. Comfrey was marked with warning cards. For poultice use, changed on schedule, never substitute for clean water. Feverfew was planted in dry corners where it would not rot. On the first training day, Travis placed his own 3 cloudy gully vials and 3 clear cistern vials on the windowsill, and had each child describe what they saw before any adult explained it. When one boy answered, "Cloudy means danger, clear means duty kept," Travis nodded and wrote the sentence into the lesson book. In 1893, after a flood season that tested every ordinance, Sage Hollow recorded 0 waterborne fever deaths, and the council sent copies of its runoff bylaws to 2 neighboring settlements by rail pouch. In 1898, when the rail spur failed for 12 winter days, bucket tags and boil boards reappeared within an hour. Not because Travis ordered it, but because trained stewards did. Blackwood, older and slower, still opened his back room in emergency weeks at fair ration prices and posted costs in chalk where all could read. He died in 1901 of a lung illness unrelated to fever, and in his final ledger he left $20 each year in perpetuity for lime purchase and cistern maintenance. The entry bore his signature and one added line: "Prosperity without discipline is only decorated risk." Travis West died on February 14, 1904, age 58, in his cabin on the chalk rise after 3 days of winter chest congestion, with Boone's pocket level on the table and the latest inspection map weighted beneath it. He was buried above the town where runoff moved away from wells, and his own marked grade, under a plain stone paid by public subscription, cost $11.60. The inscription was chosen by vote from his own words in council record, sight by consequence. The herb beds still stand on that rise. The public cistern still holds clear under its cover, and the shelf in the council room still carries the sealed letter from Laramie, the signed pamphlet once anonymous, the red flags folded and dated, and the vials that taught a town to trust evidence over pride. In Sage Hollow, when a new fence line, drain cut, or winter shed is planned, the oldest instruction remains the simplest one ever spoken there: set it by west line.